I've been asked to speak to you this morning about what happens next on Sustainable Development Agenda in Wales, because the big theme of your conference today is focusing on well-being. Well, obviously, since I'm not in government anymore, what happened next does remain the prerogative of government. But we thought it might be useful to share with you the previous consultation that the government has just been through, because there is going to be a white paper on what is going to be in the new Sustainable Development Bill that will be coming out before Christmas. So in a sense, what I would like to be able to do with you this morning is give you an opportunity to know where the consultation has got so far, and then to give you a little bit of information about what we've been doing in the University of Wales Trinity St David in terms of taking this agenda forward, and hopefully in ways that you might find useful in the context of your own setting. I wanted to start with the idea of a systems approach. I mean, it's very interesting for somebody like me who spent 10 years as a local councillor. I've not been a community councillor, but that was only probably that because when I started politics, the area that I represented did not have a community council. But I'm hugely aware, because of where I've lived for 20 years in Gweilod-y-Garth, just outside Cardiff, and also in Llandudno now, in St Dogmell's, a place that knows all about the rain that is on the roof at the moment. Hugely aware of the importance of community councils. But one of the things that's often true of those of us who are involved in political life is we're very clear about the boundaries of what we do and what others do. So there are boundaries between what community councils do and what county councils do. There are boundaries between what county councils do and what the Assembly does. There are boundaries between the powers in Wales and the powers in Westminster. But there are a whole set of things in our lives that have no boundaries whatsoever. And I find it useful somehow to think of this particular picture that I've put in front of you now. This is a globe that can be seen in the Science Museum and can be seen in science museums occasionally in temporary exhibitions across the world. This is no ordinary globe. It is, as you can see, suspended. It is huge, and therefore, when people walk round it, they're about at the level of the fenced area below. But what scientists can do with this globe is they can show you what is happening naturally. You can plot a tsunami on this globe. You can plot weather and what's happening to weather and the climate on this globe. And it takes no notice of political boundaries. You can also plot what happens to diseases. So, for example, H1N1, you can see where those diseases flow and where they stop. And one of the things that's so clear, if you look at something like the pattern of disease, is you see that in many cases, the countries which are worst affected are the poorest countries, those with least access to good health care, least access to science and technology. And I think it's important to look at this, because when we go on to look at some of the key drivers for the Sustainable Development Agenda in Wales, it does start with the fact that in 1999, those of us who were privileged to become Assembly members came into an institution where the commissioners who had set up the Assembly had made this fantastic cross-party commitment to have sustainable development there as a duty for the new institution. The institution had to have regard to sustainable development. Every incoming administration had to write a scheme saying how it was going to deliver on sustainable development, and the members of the Assembly could therefore scrutinise the executive on whether or not it was delivering that scheme effectively. And that legislation was virtually unique in the world. There are only, in fact, 2 other places in the world, Estonia and Tasmania, where constitutionally sustainable development has been written in the same way. But another key driver in Wales is the work of the Climate Change Commission and the commitment of 3% greenhouse gas emission reductions a year, which also aligns with the UK government's commitments in the context of moving more over to renewable energy and greenhouse gas emission reductions. Also in Wales, we are the only part of the United Kingdom that has a statutory commitment to education for sustainable development and global citizenship in our education system. There is not a requirement as to how it is done, but there is a requirement that it is done. And right throughout our education system, from the foundation phase all the way through to the baccalaureate, there is a requirement to demonstrate education for sustainable development and global citizenship. And undoubtedly, with the public spirit that is here in this room, some of you will already be involved in some of the community initiatives around Wales for Africa. Community initiatives that have seen more towns and villages in Wales linked with others in Africa than in any other part of the United Kingdom. And the Wales for Africa programme is run out of government, but those twinning links are run from the Wales Council for Voluntary Action. So a very strong community idea about being fair across the globe. The definition that is here, you may well have seen before, because the Brundtland definition, as it is called, is probably the most popular definition in terms of what constitutes sustainable behaviour. A very general definition, so it is possible to apply the values, the principles behind that definition to what we do in a very generic way. In Wales, in 2009, the government published One Wales, One Planet, which is still the existing Sustainable Development Scheme until the new government creates a new one. And there are 5 high-level indicators for that to make it clear that sustainable development is not an environmental agenda, although we always have to be acutely aware of environmental limits when we're thinking about whether or not we're acting sustainably. But we have to look at a sustainable economy. We have to look at social justice. We have to look at our ecological footprint, what Wales consumes as a nation. And some of you will have heard me say before, and others say before, that if you actually look at the ecological footprint of Wales now, each of us in this room is consuming as though we had 3 planets available to us. And since we clearly don't have 3 planets available to us, it means that our consumption patterns are outstripping the ability of the world to supply it. Some nations are outstripping it a lot more. In the States, for example, and in some parts of the States in particular, that can go up to 4, 5, or even 8 times the capacity of the world to deliver. But you won't be surprised to find that in places like Africa, or even India or China, if you take this down on a per capita basis, people in those parts of the world are consuming either on or less than the world's capacity. And all of this is about contributing towards our future well-being. Well-being is at the heart of what you're looking at today. Well-being is at the heart of making a sustainable development agenda work effectively. In order for there to be changes in the Welsh system, there have to be political commitments framed in a manifesto. And the political commitment in the manifesto of the government was to take the One Wales, One Planet agenda and say that the next stage of that process was to move to turn that into legislation to apply to the public sector in Wales. That led, therefore, to a legislative commitment, which you see on the screen. It has 2 key components. legislating to make sustainable development the central organising principle of the Welsh Government and public bodies in Wales, and creating an independent body which could actually scrutinise, advise or inform on that agenda. And the legislation came about because at the end of the last government, both the Wales Audit Office and an independent consultant looked at whether or not the previous commitment that had been made by the Cabinet, the coalition Cabinet of Labour and Plaid Cymru, and supported by other parties, of having sustainable development at the heart of government, had it worked. And it found that it had worked in some places, but what it had not done is institutionally change the practice of the organisation. And it was those really important reports, both in policy terms from the WWF and in business terms from the Wales Audit Office, that then led to the commitment to make legislation. And in terms of this year in particular, of course, we've had the Rio Conference. There is an institutional framework for sustainable development being developed on the back of that. And some of you will know that the Millennium Development Goals, which were obviously agreed in the millennium in terms of tackling the poverty agenda, are now to become Sustainable Development Goals in 2015 as a result of the decisions taken across the world in Rio. Rio also looked at advantages of the green economy, and it's interesting that only a couple of weeks ago, a report from a group of organisations called the Green Alliance demonstrated that the green economy, i.e. tackling recycling, for example, looking at issues around renewable energy, energy efficiency and others, was actually running at about 5% positively in the economy at the moment, where of course the rest of our economy is in recession. So really interesting that the market is going for the green economic agenda. This is the government slide in terms of the outcome of sustainable development, where you have economic, social and environmental well-being. So right in the centre of this vision, where you have sustainable resource use, you don't exceed what is available, you have a sustainable economy, you have a sustainable society, you do sustain the environment appropriately, that will lead to well-being in Wales. So the duty that is coming forward is about building on what has been done previously. Obviously, the duty was there in 1999. It's been tested in the period up until 2012. But the duty that currently exists on the Assembly, that I said a few moments ago, where the Assembly has to have a scheme, there's actually nothing in the duty that makes it clear that the Assembly has to have a good scheme. It just has to have a scheme. So in terms of making sure that it's effective legislation for the future, an effective duty, this is where the agenda is going at the moment. So the government consulted recently on whether or not the duty should affect how we behave, how organisations behave, if everything they did was influenced by long-term thinking, or whether or not it should be influenced by objectives, and would therefore there be a new set of objectives which public sector organisations could sign up to, which would contribute towards delivering this agenda, or some combination of the two. The government also wanted to look at where should the duty bite, which organisations should be affected by it, and how should the work of those organisations be affected. So here, when we think of how it should bite, because that's what will matter to you in terms of your roles, is it about higher level decisions being taken to be required to have more than regard to sustainable development principles, which is what the situation is at the moment? Is it about those behaviours? Is it about objectives? And how should compliance be reported? Clearly, we all would want organisations to be transparent and accountable in the way that they respond to this or any other duty. So how can it be done so it doesn't become a new and therefore burdensome reporting arrangement, but so it gets included in the normal territory? And there was a list in the consultation of the bodies to be covered, and as you'll see there on the bottom right, I've outlined in red for you, we have all the public sector organisations in Wales, including town and community councils, will be affected by the duty. The government also wanted to know what people thought of what the new Sustainable Development Body should look like. Should it have an ombudsman type role when there are already existing organisations as advocates for specific causes? Should it have a scrutiny role when you have, for example, the Auditor General for Wales already scrutinising what you do? Should it have an expert advice and guidance role? And the responses to the consultations have now just been published, so you may be interested, and it may be possible for One Wales to make available to you those comments, because they'll be what the government is taking into account in moving forward. But in a sense, all those elements are about how to make sure that in this fantastic country of ours, which is so much to celebrate environmentally, the first fair trade country in the world, therefore so much to celebrate socially and about our communities, how can we, as a country, really bring together those links between society, economy and the environment, about what we do now and what we want to leave generations for the future, and about our relationship in the world and what we as individuals and as organisations do to take this agenda forward. And that leads on to what we've been doing in our university in Trinity St David. Some of you will have picked up yesterday that Trinity St David, which was the new name for the merged University of Lampeter and Trinity College in Carmarthen, has now merged with Swansea Metropolitan University yesterday, and we're looking also to merge with Coleg Ceredigion and with Coleg Sir Degard to create a new regional set of opportunities in this and further southwest in Wales. And as that process was starting, the university decided that it wanted to put sustainable development at the heart of what it did, and therefore we've been working over the last year to pilot what taking that government agenda forward would look like in the context of the university. So we made some decisions about what we wanted to do. We wanted to be clear that as a university we would support the development of the area as a low carbon region. We wanted to be able to support research and evaluate sustainable practice in a rural setting. We wanted to work with others to develop cross-society exemplars of sustainability in practice. We wanted to look at what we did ourselves, and we now have campus plans, environment management systems in place, faculty plans to ensure that by next year, every student coming to any part of our university will have a sustainability lens operating at about 15% of any course that they do with us. And we see this very strongly as improving the employability prospects of our graduates for the future. And we also wanted and do want to develop partnerships with other organisations with a similar agenda. So here in Pontrhydd Vendigaid, we're working at the moment with Ceredigion County Council, with the Prince's Regeneration Trust, with the Strata Florida Trust, in looking at creating a fantastic new opportunity for sustainable heritage skills building by looking at purchasing the old farmhouse here and creating that as a centre for traditional natural building skills. We're working with Hywel Dda in terms of creating a chair of rural well-being. We pay half in Lampeter, half in Aberystwyth, and look at what needs to make a community healthy rather than just look at responses to sickness, and that post is being advertised at the moment. And we're working with the councils on looking at other opportunities to deliver sustainability projects. But a lot of this has to be about the evidence base. Our governors were not particularly persuaded of the sustainability agenda when the university started on this journey, but they are now. And they are because the skills that we can give young people in the university through applying this agenda are the skills that employers want. Back in 2010, a leadership skills for a sustainable economy commissioned by Business in the Community showed that 90% of businesses recognise sustainable development skills as critical, and 80% thought there was a need to put more urgent programmes in place. We've been discussing with businesses and others that if we are able to produce graduates who can appreciate the importance of environment, social and political context to their studies, can solve or ameliorate real-life problems, can think creatively and holistically, are self-reliant, able to understand, critically evaluate and adopt thoughtfully sustainable values, applying theory in practice, working collaboratively in teams, and initiating and managing change, is that what businesses want for the future? And there is a resounding yes. And interestingly, from the NUS perspective, a report that's been tracking the views of students over the last 3 years has shown unequivocally that students think their universities should prepare them better for employability, and as part of that they see the same skills as being the skills they want to acquire out of the university agenda. So we're one example, but you as an organisation are already working. You're working with Cynnal Cymru on the Strong Roots initiative. You're working with Aberystwyth University on research study and looking at economic development and community energy in the context of community councils. And you've also been eligible for a grant looking at work to identify your own adaptation role in terms of climate change and what behaviour change needs to take place on the back of that. And every single week brings another example, sadly, and has particularly brought us examples in Ceredigion of the importance of that work. But at the end of the day, this is about sustainable development being as of competitive advantage. Competitive advantage to people going through university, competitive advantage to organisations because they are better prepared for the future, and competitive advantage to Wales as a country and Wales as a nation in terms of demonstrating a strong set of values about ensuring that we believe in leaving our country a better place for future generations. And we in this room, as guardians of elements of that, whether that's at the Town and Community Council level, the Parish Council level, whether that is at the local authority level, and there are many local authority county councillors here today, whether that's at the Welsh Assembly and government level, or at the UK level. This is a time, I think, when it's really important that we have strong values as we move forward in difficult times. And I think it's probably best to finish with leaving two quotes for you. Mark Twain, who continues to say wise things, and on an agenda around survival of the fittest, let's make sure that we are the fittest. Because, as Charles Darwin said, it is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change. Thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr iawn.